Morning everyone. I'm Elsa Rayburn. I'm the chair of Community Land Scotland. I'm really pleased that we're delivering this webinar today in partnership with the Community Woodlands Association, and John Hollingdale, the Chief Officer there, will be speaking to you shortly. Thanks very much for joining us today. It's great to see old friends on the call, but also lots of new faces. This is a really important subject. It's relatively new to us here at Community Land Scotland and to lots of our members, but certainly an area of work that we're all going to become, I think, much more involved and engaged with. So thanks for joining us today. This is just a short introduction from me with housekeeping. So all of your microphones should be muted. Kerry, our assistant, will be helping make sure that happens. If you do have any technical problems, if you can use the chat function please, and let us know about those and we'll try and resolve them. There is a function for Q&A, so if you could use the Q&A box for any questions for the panel please, that would be appreciated, because sometimes they get lost in the chat. We have had some questions already to kick us off, which is really great. We've got a really interesting range of speakers which John's going to introduce to you, and we have all warned them about Kerry's bell, which we'll be giving them shortly before their time is up. So we'll try and stick to time and make sure that we finish by 12:30 today. So I'm going to pass you over to John, who will give you a bit more of an introduction about what we're going to be talking about today. It is a really complex subject, and this is just an introductory webinar, but hopefully be the first of several discussions that we have on this topic. So I'll pass you over to John Hollingdale from the Community Woodlands Association, who's going to let you know who our speakers are and what they're going to be talking about. Thanks, John.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Elsa. And I'd like to extend that welcome to everybody. It's great that there's so many people registered and joining this webinar. Just a really brief introduction from me. Community Woodlands Association, for those who don't know us, we were established in 2003, and our role is to support community woodland groups across Scotland to achieve their aspirations. And we're very happy to advise any community groups on woodland creation or woodland management plans. Now, today's webinar, we're working on the basis that everybody here understands the basic premise, the position we're in with the global climate emergency, and also the role that well-designed and appropriately located woodlands might play in helping tackle that through the sequestration of carbon. There are really two key messages on top of that. There are many good reasons to create new woodlands, not just carbon, and any woodlands that are being created by communities or by anybody else that way ought to be delivering multiple benefits for local communities and the world, not just sequestrating carbon, important though that is. And the second key message that we want to stress, we're talking about carbon credits, is that buying and selling carbon credits does not absolve anybody from the urgent need to reduce emissions. The units that are being created and sold are there to mop up the genuinely unavoidable emissions and not to allow us to carry on with business as usual. Nonetheless, woodland carbon code, woodland carbon credits, and the other potential ecosystem services are potentially a great way for enabling us to do things that we've wanted to do but haven't been able to do in the past because the finance just didn't stack up. That's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. I'm going to move on very quickly to introduce the first speaker, which is Andy Baker from the Woodland Carbon Code team, who's going to give us a quick run through of a really complicated subject of how the Woodland Carbon Code works and basically how you get involved. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks a lot, John. No, it's, as you say, it's a very big topic and there's a lot to cover, so I will try to be as quick as I can be. But yeah, thanks for that introduction. As John says, I work for the Woodland Carbon Code team, and I am looking at explaining essentially what the Woodland Carbon Code is and, as John says, how to get involved. So this is essentially what I'm going to cover. So what is the Carbon Code? What do you need to do to be eligible for the Carbon Code? The obligations that you will have as a landowner. the summary of processes and costs, just quite vague figures, but just to give you an idea of how much it can cost to become involved in it. A bit of an explanation as to the grouping of projects, a bit more in depth than I normally would, because I think for your community woodlands, that's going to be a very important part of how you make the Woodland Carbon Code costs and benefits make financial sense, really. Then onto the monetisation of carbon units and looking at sources of further information. But to start with, as John said, absolutely rightly so, the UK government, it's the UK government-backed standard for woodland carbon projects, and it helps companies to become carbon neutral or carbon negative and the UK to meet their national targets, but only for those residual emissions. The first step for any organisation should always be to reduce your emissions down as much as absolutely possible, and it's just those last emissions that can't be avoided that should really be offset through the Woodland Carbon Code. It's based on incredibly high standards. It's based on robust science through forest research. It's got a transparent registry, so you can see everyone who's bought carbon units and where they've gone, what they've been used to offset for. And then it's independently validated and verified by organisations such as the Soil Association and Organic Farmers and Growers. And then finally, it allows for the generation of the units, of carbon units. Now, I'll go on to this in a moment, but essentially 1 unit represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent being sequestered into the woodland. So that's drawn down into the biomass of the trees and into the soils, etc. The E represents other global warming gases, not just carbon dioxide, such as methane, nitrous oxide, that sort of thing. There are 2 types of units: pending issuance units, PIUs, and woodland carbon units, WCUs. I'll come on to those in a minute. There's a very important distinction between the 2. But just to explain about how we are governed and the processes involved. So I work for Scottish Forestry, so the Forestry Commission in Scotland, and we govern the scheme on behalf of all UK forest agencies. It's backed by research, as I mentioned, from Forest Research, the UK government's Forest Research Department, and also international research as well. We're endorsed by ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, which is a big deal. Basically, getting the accreditation from them is essentially saying, yes, we pass all of their additionality, permanence, etc. criteria, and shows that the credits we're generating can be used formally to offset an organisation's carbon footprint. We work with the Forestry Commission and with the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland and NRW in Wales. And so working together with all these organisations is really useful, because the implementation of the carbon code with just a Scotland-centric view isn't ideal. We need to make sure that we're in association with all these other bodies to make sure that we're making it applicable for everyone. And so I mentioned I was going to touch on to what a unit is. So essentially, as trees grow, they sequester carbon, but they don't do that straight away. When you plant a tree, no, there's no real carbon gain until they've grown and stored that carbon through photosynthesis into the biomass of the tree. So what we do to facilitate this, because at the moment, forestry inherently is quite difficult cash flow wise, because it's all back-ended. So what we try to do with the carbon credits is by providing 2 types of carbon credits, this PIU, a promise to deliver essentially. What we allow for is the sale of carbon units up front, saying that, okay, well, we expect this woodland, for example, will sequester 500 tonnes of carbon over 100 years. And so what we will do is, once this project has been registered and validated, we will provide you with 500 pending issuance units that you can sell or you can hold on to, whatever you want to do. Over time, at regular verifications every 10 years throughout that 100-year project, a proportion of those 500 pending issuance units will be converted into actual woodland carbon units. And as I say, this illustrates the fact that we are promising to deliver 500 tonnes of carbon, and over time, if the trees have grown as expected, you will sequester 500 tonnes of carbon that can be formally used to offset against a company's carbon emissions. So at year 0, at year 1, you'll have 500 PIUs and no WCUs, and then at year 100, you'll have 0 PIUs and 500 WCUs if all goes as planned. And that's demonstrating the fact that you've locked in that carbon. Now, crucially importantly, the final thing I'll say on this is why there's a difference between the two in terms of what does it matter. If I was a company buying units, why does it matter to me whether I buy PIUs or WCUs? Because it governs what you can say about your carbon neutrality status and about what you've bought. So if I was a company and I had 500 tons of residual emissions this year and I bought 500 WCUs, actual carbon units, I could say I am carbon neutral. If I bought 500 PIUs, the pending units, all I could say is I am working towards carbon neutrality. As time goes on and the carbon reductions begin to become compulsory, carbon taxes could become involved, you can see how important that distinction becomes. And so generally WCUs will be more valuable than PIUs, but it's not quite as simple as that, and I'll come on to that later on. And then this is just a picture of a ton of carbon, because I quite like that. It's more than I thought it would be. Next of all, looking at the eligibility of land. So first of all, it's only for new woodland creation. At the moment, there's a potential that the Woodland Carbon Code may start to assign units for improvements in woodland management, changes in woodland management, but at the moment it's only for new woodland creation. Next of all, there's no minimum or maximum area. I'll come on to the grouping side of things later on, which goes into this in a bit more detail, but you can go down as low as you want to 0.1 hectare if you wanted to. However, there are economies of scale when you come onto the cost section that make, realistically, if you're going for less than half a hectare, you have to group your projects quite effectively to make the finances stack up. It can include natural regeneration, natural recolonization. It's just a slightly different calculation that we do to accommodate that, but it's definitely included. Hedgerows aren't, unfortunately, at the moment, but they are something that we're still working on to develop some robust science behind that to see if it's worthwhile. And then it must be additional. Now, this is a very tricky topic, but I don't think it's going to be too contentious for you guys. But essentially, what it's asking, additionality, this premise that was internationally set by the Kyoto Protocol and pre-Kyoto years ago that we must adhere to, is essentially asking the question, would the woodland have been planted regardless of carbon finance, so the sale of your carbon units? If the answer is yes, we would have planted it anyway. Carbon is just another source of income that we wanted as well. You won't pass additionality and you won't be allowed to generate carbon units and sell them. Now, answering that question, as you can imagine, is very difficult. Would you have planted it? Well, it's quite subjective. And how do you prove that you would or wouldn't have planted it without carbon finance? So there are some tests that we put the project through. But as I say, I won't dwell on this too much because it is quite complicated, but generally for most of your schemes, I don't think this will be a major issue. You're generally talking about it becoming an issue when you've got very strong commercially driven schemes, whether that's from timber or other credits like biodiversity credits and stuff, making your woodland creation a definite. Why would you not plant woodland there, even without carbon? It's making money hand over fist. They're the schemes that we say, well, we're not going to assign you carbon units. But as I said, I don't think it'll be a major issue for you. So next of all, looking at the obligations for landowner, very important. And so essentially, you must replant in case of catastrophe. Now that sounds logical, but at the moment, if you were to plant a woodland and you weren't part of the Woodland Carbon Code and you had, let's say, a 10-year grant maintenance scheme, under that grant scheme, you would be obliged to replant your woodland in case of catastrophe, fire, wind, something like that. Not that wind would really affect a 10-year-old tree, but fire, let's say. You would be obliged to replant within that 10-year period if something happened, or give back your grant money. Once you are beyond that 10-year period, you've got no obligation to replant at all. If the fire devastates your woodland in year 11 and your last maintenance payment was in year 10, you just say, well, it's a shame, but we'll let natural regeneration take its course. If you are under the Woodland Carbon Code scheme, if you have a 100-year project, you have to replant every time there's a catastrophe, if there's ever a catastrophe, which is obviously unlikely, but it's an important factor to consider. You must verify every 10 years, so at year 5 and then every subsequent 10 years as a minimum, and I'll come on to that in a moment. You must manage your project as you initially outlined in your carbon calculation and your management plan. You can change things, but this will change the number of units that are assigned to you, so it can get quite complicated, but you can change them, but as a general premise, stick to what you say you're going to do. You must manage it to the UK forestry standard, and you potentially may have to buy back units if you've oversold at the start. So let's say you were predicted 500 units in year one, and then the woodland only actually generated 400 units. You may have to buy back 100 units down the line. Again, things are changing very rapidly with this, so I won't dwell on it too long, but it's just something to be aware of at the moment. Next of all, a summary of the processes and costs. So process-wise, you must, as of July 1st, we've only got a month left, but at the moment, you can register a project that was planted within the last 2 years. Moving forwards from July 1st, you must register your project pre-planting. If there's nothing you take away from this webinar, bar this one thing, that is the thing to take away. You must register your projects pre-planting. Next of all, you must validate your project, which is essentially an off-site check by the Soil Association or Organic Farmers and Growers, the validation bodies, where they will check through all your paperwork, etc., and just say, yeah, okay, you've planted your scheme as you should have, and so we are going to assign you the units. At year 5, once you've planted, you are then going to verify your project, which is usually an on-site check from the Soil Association, Organic Farmers and Growers, and then you must do that every 10 years and provide a monitoring report. And what that is essentially doing is then checking that the woodland is growing as you expected it would. And at those verification points, they're the points where you'll convert a proportion of your PIUs into WCUs. This gives you an idea about the costs. So I've talked about the timing, but I've broken it down into direct costs and indirect costs. So direct costs being the ones to the validators that you can expect. And then indirect costs are costs that if you were to go through a project developer, for instance, and they were to charge you to do the service on their behalf as well. So you'll need both of those. So if you wanted to just go down the direct cost route and provide all the paperwork yourself, obviously that's going to keep it cheaper, but it's quite complicated. So it may be worth going through a project developer, and their associated costs are there as a very general guide. Now, the reason that they range so enormously is because of the grouping of schemes. Essentially, if you group schemes together very efficiently, then you can reduce the costs far to the lower end of these predictions. But if you don't group them effectively and go alone, it can be quite expensive. But obviously for the bigger schemes, even that expense is minimal, but even so, something to be aware of. So I've mentioned grouping several times now. So essentially, it is just a marriage of convenience. That's how it's been described to me. You are in no way obligated. If I was to have one project that was based in Devon and another one that was based up in John O'Groats, I could group those together, different natured schemes, and that's not a problem at all. If one of them was to burn down, that doesn't negatively affect the other one. If you want to sell units from this one, but not from that one, that's absolutely fine. It's simply a marriage of convenience at this point. Now, within a group, you can have 15 standard projects, which are anything above 5 hectares, and 50 hectares of small projects, and the small projects is anything below 5 hectares. So you can see how you can make some quite big groups, because one of these standard projects may be 1,000 hectares. And so grouping this together, as I say, reduces the cost down. So I'd recommend looking at how strategically you can make sure that you're grouping as effectively as you can. You can include any type of project, as I say, at the moment. And the only real requirement is they must be planted within 5 consecutive planting years of one another. Moving forwards, they can be grouped post-registration or validation. So even if you were to register as a single project and then collaborate with some other community groups or landowners and say, let's group these together to keep costs down, put a group agreement in place post-registration, that's absolutely fine. And then you can significantly reduce ongoing costs. Now, I'll look at monetizing units. I'm just aware of time. So monetizing carbon units, how much can you make? So essentially, you can range from £6 per unit to £25 a unit, depending on a variety of factors. You can generate anywhere between 100 to 500 units per hectare, again, depending on a variety of factors. And so you can quite easily look at 600 to 12,500 units per hectare through the sale of carbon units. So what are the factors that affect things? Well, first of all, you're looking at the location of the site. The closer to companies and cities generally, the higher the price you'll get. You're looking at the nature of the project. Some companies like mixed broadleaves, some companies like commercial projects, so that can affect the price. the vintage of the units, and so when they are likely to convert into WCUs affects the price, how flexible you are in terms of allowing land, public access and that sort of thing on your site, what stage of the project you're at, if you're pre-planting or post-planting can make changes to the price offered, and then what are the associated benefits, so wildlife, community, water and economy. These are all driven through our Woodland benefits tool that you can complete as part of that validation process. The more associated benefits there are, the higher the value of the units are going to be. And then as a final point, just looking at how to monetize these units. So you can sell PRUs, WCUs, you can sell them at any time in any quantity. I could sell 10 of those 500 today, 50 tomorrow, and then the rest in 100 years time if I wanted to. The vintage that you sell them, so units that are likely to convert within the next 5 years, they'll be more valuable than ones that are going to take longer to convert into WCUs based on what companies can claim because of them. You can sell to anybody looking to offset their UK-based emissions, and so not for international emissions. You can offer annual payments if people are looking at becoming quite savvy and a little bit more imaginative with how they pay landowners for carbon units. They will pay you £200 per hectare per year for the next 20 years, and you give us all of your carbon. That is something that a lot of companies are looking at. Through the carbon code itself, we're looking at automating sales as we go through the website. So you just put your details onto our website and then companies can just buy 10 units at a fixed price that you've set, that sort of thing. But that's hopefully coming soon. And you can also bundle or stack this with other credits and grants, because there are very lucrative grant schemes out there for forestry at the moment anyway. So if you add carbon finance, add biodiversity credits into that, you can bundle and stack all of these units so long as you pass additionality. And then there's also the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, and essentially this is a reverse auction process to allow for the government to buy some of your units from you as they become WCUs. However, it's not massively important. I think people get stuck on this quite a bit, but essentially it allows for the sale, a guaranteed price for your carbon units moving forwards. And again, sorry, I've had to rush through this slightly. It's been a bit of a whirlwind, but in terms of places for further information, you've got the Woodland Carbon Code website, the resources page on our website, and speak to some project developers on our project developer page. They would be more than happy to help you, I am sure. And that's it from me. So sorry, I've slightly gone over time, but I will pass back to you, John, for the next person to present.
Andy, thank you very much. That was brilliant and an amazing amount of information crammed into 15 minutes or so. So that's great. If folk have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom. We do have 20 minutes or so for questions at the end of the webinar. But we'll move on, and the next first of a couple of speakers who are going to be talking about their experiences of implementing this on the ground or trying to work their way through the process on the ground. So first is Becca Long from the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust. Becca, time for you now.
All right, hopefully everybody can see that. So as John said, I'm Becca and I'm the Business Development Manager for the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust. And I've been asked to talk a bit more about our recent activity and experience on egg with the Woodland Carbon Code. But I thought I'd start with a bit of context about egg before focusing on our specific project here. A few pretty pictures for you. I'm sure everyone is familiar with where we're situated. But a couple of photos here. Egg is one of the 4 small isles, which is south of Skye. Our ferry operates out of Mallaig, and it's a 16-kilometre journey across the sea to reach us. It's been community owned. The island's been community. Oh, that might help. Hopefully everybody can see that now. We've been community owned since 1997, so IEHT owns and manages egg on behalf of Egg's residents. The Trust's main objectives really focus on creating opportunities for social and economic development, as well as creating opportunity, as well as to conserve Egg's natural and cultural heritage, to ensure sustainable development, delivering local needs locally, and ultimately to grow and retain a viable and empowered population. Our population has actually increased by 70% since 1997, to 110. We've got 17 under the age of 16 now. And we get something in the way of 10,000 visitors a year, pre-COVID, of course. And as an island, we are very much aspiring to work towards a carbon net zero target by 2030. And we've got a lot of different projects which we are working on both now and in the future pipeline. EGG's very well known for its green energy grid. We're looking at other ways that we can diversify within the community. So EGG is actually only 8 kilometres by 5 kilometres, but the Trust's responsibilities include management of about 247 hectares of forest land. That's split within 13 compartments, which are highlighted here on the map that you can see. Over the years, EGG has worked through many different woodland management plans, but in 2017 we signed off on our very first long-term forest plan with Scottish Forestry. The main activities within the plan include a phased programme of harvesting of EGG's mature conifer plantation, which is this big compartment that you can see me circling in the middle here, which is a Sitka spruce plantation. Then thinning and restocking within the other compartments, and opportunities for woodland creation. And an ambition within the plan was also to establish a tree nursery right here on EGG, with the aim to protect our island biosecurity, but also to improve the rates, the survival rates of tree stock being planted in. We've got quite an exposed island environment. So it's fair to say it's been a busy few years in the woods, particularly since signing off on our forest plan, as we've started to get to grips with our responsibilities. I'll just talk through quickly 3 of the main areas. So EGG wood fuel. So we've spent a lot of time and effort restructuring the enterprise, investing in infrastructure with the help of the Climate Challenge Fund, namely a very large drying shed and a tractor, so that we could move from a very reactive structure to building a reliable and consistent supply for island residents and businesses. And in fact, we've more than doubled sales in the last 3 years. So we're seeing some very good momentum building there. We went through our first phase of timber harvesting, which concluded in autumn 2019. Not a very big scale for commercial forestry terms. It was approximately 12 hectares in total of Sitka spruce, which is about 3,250 tonnes. And we retained 700 of that, 700 tonnes of the material for stocking the onward wood fuel supply, which should hopefully keep us going for about 3 to 4 years before we have to address phase 2 of the project. And then the egg tree nursery. So led by Tasha Fife, who's one of our residents on EGG, we established the Isle of Egg Tree Nursery in 2018. It was a combination of polytunnel and some outside beds. Tasha worked very hard over the course of the first year, 18 months. Got the nursery FRM registered, allowing us to both provide stock for new projects on EGG, but projects elsewhere that share the same seed provenance zone as us. So the nursery produced, I think, about 7,000 stems in the first year and about 13,000 in year 2. And Tasha and a group of volunteers have invested huge resource into native seed collection on EGG. She maintains a master seed database, but this year we're also working on expanding the nursery's production to include larger volumes of conifers to support the mixed restocking of the phase 1 compartments that came down in 2019. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about our woodland creation project. So this site was identified within the long-term forest plan as a suitable site for the woodland creation project. And the map on the right there, you can just see the hatched green area, which is it borders the back of our mixed conifer plantation and joins up with another woodland, which is called Sandoval Woodland. The site is about 28.5 hectares in total, but after a Scottish Forestry site visit, basically just investigating the site for suitability for planting, and the presence of deep peat and then other factors meant we agreed a planting scheme of 12.74 hectares in total. Iona Hyde from the Woodland Trust came into the picture at this stage, and has been instrumental in supporting us from the very beginning of the process, hiring an agent to help us prepare our forest grant scheme application, as we didn't have the experience in-house to manage that factor ourselves. Our application was subsequently approved, and then Tasha, Fife, Iona and myself then got to work on how we were going to approach actually planting the scheme. So it's a native broadleaf scheme. These pictures just give a little bit of a feel for the site itself. Our ambition was to grow all of the stock in the tree nursery from seed harvested from natives on egg. Quite a lofty ambition, but I am delighted to say that all 17,500 trees were grown in the Isle of Egg tree nursery, albeit over 2 growing seasons. With the hit of the pandemic, we then had to look at our options for planting in the scheme. So originally we had been discussing options with Iona for bringing in external contract planters. That didn't really feel feasible last year. So looking again, we realised that this was actually something we could achieve entirely on island. So Tasha led a team of 3 planters who effectively formed a bit of a bubble to complete the 6 weeks of planting. They had a support team of 2. One individual was actually in the tree nursery, packaging up the trees ready to take to site. And the other was actually transporting the trees and dropping them at agreed locations across the site. Luckily, we only needed a small amount of fencing required, which was also completed by an egg contractor. The timescale, so they were planting between sort of January or end of January to March of this year. And Tasha and I actually went for a walk around the site a few weeks back. And I have to say, what an achievement for the planting team, but also dealing with some particularly interesting weather conditions. I think they had everything thrown at them: snow, hail, frozen ground, a lot of rain. And there's some quite difficult terrain across the site to contend with. So all in all, a big achievement for egg. So coming on to the carbon code then, so with the scheme complete, attention really turned to opportunities with carbon. I'd already done some research myself for the trust, on behalf of the trust, and had a loose understanding of the Woodland Carbon Code and the opportunity that might be there for the trust, but hadn't taken it any further at that stage. The Woodland Trust approached us at the end of the project and highlighted the deadline of the 30th of June to register schemes already planted. And so, as with all proposals, the Trust went through its due diligence. What the Woodland Trust were effectively offering us was to purchase the carbon units associated with the Sandoval project. So they would register and validate the scheme with the Woodland Carbon Code, and then they would sell the units to partners that they work with. One of the things the Trust was particularly interested in was who these partners were, and I think this was touched on at the beginning. We're not interested in helping any greenwashing. The Woodland Trust were very reassuring with their vetting process. They were talking about the risk assessment process that they go through with any of their potential partners, and that the partners need to be able to demonstrate that they don't just have a decarbonising policy, that they're actually taking steps towards delivering it. And obviously it's a reputational risk to the Woodland Trust as well in not partnering with the right people. So that was reassuring to the Trust. Once the scheme is validated, it will then be verified at 5 years, then 10 years, and then every 10 year, and then in 10-year increments from that point on to ensure its development. Again, the Woodland Trust is saying that they can come in and support us in making sure that we achieve those verification dates. And as part of the validation process, what's built into it is a 20% buffer built into the calculations to help mitigate any issues on the site. For example, if the trees don't grow at the expected rate, for example. The Woodland Trust also did ask for a conservation burden, but this wasn't essential in our situation, and it's not something that's been pushed. And in terms of payment schedule, I think we've agreed a percentage payment, which will be payable once the scheme has been validated, and then the remaining value will be paid over the 15 years as an annual payment. So the scheme itself, I think that we're actually registering into the scheme is 10 hectares. So I guess it's it's at the lower end of the scheme sizes that Andy was talking about. But again, it's a good size for egg. So the proposal coming from the Woodland Trust, we had a lot to think about. The Trust then took some independent advice from John Hollingdale at the Community Woodlands Association, Amanda Bryan, who's the previous chairperson of the Trust, and Elsa also put us in touch with Savills. So Savills had estimated a higher carbon tonnage per hectare and a higher sales price, but with the Trust taking on the costs of registration and validation of the scheme. And taking things there from ourselves, by ourselves. However, the advice from both Amanda and John were that the Woodland Trust proposal represented good value for the market as it stands right now. And John then helped us work through a bit more of the detail of what we might expect out of the scheme. So looking at more of the detail of what we had actually planted in to the Woodland Creation Project and how we'd planted it in. We also know, we've got our eyes open, that the expectation is that the market price will rise. However, partnering with the Woodland Trust is more than just about the financial opportunity that's present. It's importantly really looking at the wider benefits for the Trust here, looking at how we support an ongoing relationship with the Woodland Trust, supporting a continuation of skills building, expansion of the tree nursery, etc. So really looking at the wider benefits for the community here on Egg. And the capital really also comes at a time where there's lots of upcoming costs in Egg's Woodlands. So the aim is to invest the capital from this directly back into Egg's Woodlands to help us continue to meet our long-term forest plan objectives. So at this stage, we're at the very beginning of the process. The scheme has been registered and we're just working through the upcoming next steps. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully that's been useful, and I'll hand you back to John.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. It's fascinating, a really impressive project, especially the way that it was delivered kind of almost entirely in-house under all the circumstances of COVID and the rest of it. We're moving on. The second speaker from the community sector, I'm going to hand over to Kevin Cummings from the John Muir Trust and the Langham Initiative, talking about how carbon finance was involved in the purchase of the Tarras Valley Nature Reserve site very recently. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much. I'll just get the presentation up here and just make sure people can see it. Can everyone see and hear?
We can see your video, but we can't see your presentation yet, Kevin.
Okay, well, it worked earlier. Let's try that again. How's that?
That's it now, yeah.
Grand. Okay, folks, again, I will try and get through as much as I can here. It's been quite good having both Andy and Rebecca go there, because they've both maybe covered a couple of things I would have said that I can leave now, and I'm sure I'll maybe say a couple of things that for the speakers coming after me, they'll go, oh, be quiet and stop saying the things we were going to talk about. So I'm glad I'm kind of in the middle here. So my name's Kevin Cumming, and I was the project leader of the Langham Moor community buyout over the last 2 years. I'm still a trustee of the Langham Initiative now, and I'm continuing to be involved in the project there going forward as it starts to kick off following the completion of the purchase at the end of March this year. But I'm also employed at the John Muir Trust as the Land Operations Manager South, so I cover the John Muir Trust properties from Ben Nevis down to Helvellyn in the Lake District. So that includes Schiehallion and Glenlude as well. But the picture that I've got up on the slide there of Langham Moor looking west over towards the monument there, and Langham on the other side of that hill, does give us just a little wee insight into the site here, where you've actually got quite a lot of natural regeneration happening here of ancient woodland. You've got the sort of plateau of moorland up here, which is actually really heavily drained. And in the foreground here, you've actually got some old commercial forestry plantation. So You can start to get an idea of the site here already with the sort of mix of previous land uses and sort of the environmental bits on the land itself. But as we've got very sort of quick time to talk about things here, I've got 4 main points that I'm going to speak about, and then happy to take any questions at the end. But I'll just move on to the first point there, which is land value and the difficulties for communities in finding funding for purchase. And suspecting that Callum may have come onto this towards the end, but you know, it's quite well documented that for the purchase at Langham, we had to raise a very large amount of money. We ended up pulling together 3.8 million in 4 months for the purchase here. And I think that before getting into the ins and outs of our sort of woodland creation element here, I think it is worth, for those who are on the call who are maybe thinking about purchasing land or purchasing woodland, who have got their community organisation together and are exploring this journey, or looking at expanding their existing community holding, is that this sort of greater interest in sequestering carbon dioxide and carbon is going to have an impact on land values. And certainly I can see a danger of this becoming another barrier to addressing land ownership value balances in Scotland. We're already starting to see on the prospectuses for estates that are going up on the market that this is starting to be put front and centre of those prospectuses. It's starting to talk a lot about natural capital and the ability to sequester carbon for the site. So it's certainly something that's going to have to be addressed. And what we certainly noticed when you're trying to buy a land holding that has quite high open market value is that there aren't a huge amount of funders available specifically for land purchase. And this is where we start to shift this sort of talk that I'm doing just now onto carbon, is that started to be the real focus people had about how they might manage to help us. And again, this is just some more natural regeneration that's happening of ancient woodland on the site already. But what role did carbon play in the purchase at Langham? And again, this is maybe a little bit of a strange one and probably worthwhile having today, because carbon has played a part at Langham before we've actually done anything. We got to the point of having about 3.6 million in funds, and we were about 200 grand short from the 3.8 we ended up agreeing with the landowner. And essentially what we ended up doing is pre-selling carbon to the Woodland Trust in order to allow them to provide capital now. So for those that have dealt with the Woodland Trust going forward or in the past, so the Woodland Trust are not a grant giving organisation. They're not set up that way. So for them to be able to give funding up front, it has to be for something back, which, you know, was something we were being asked from various different people if we wanted to do it anyway. But it's played a major role here. So we were absolutely inundated with companies offering to do something similar, and similar to what Rebecca was just saying. You know, one of the foundations of the community buyout in Langham is on having an environmental element to it. It was really the thing that the community felt most strongly about, whether that is carbon, whether that's wildlife conservation. It was the key benefit that the community wanted to address, and the potential for tourism that might draw in. But we were very minded that choosing a partner that had the right reputation, that dealt with the right third parties, was really important to us, and that's where the Woodland Trust came in. So the picture that I've chosen to put up here works in a few ways for us on this conversation, because it gives you a couple of the different land uses and what we're hoping to do. So we've got the natural regeneration happening down in the Taris Valley here, and the River Taris is just running along the centre of the picture, just out of sight at the moment. But this sort of grassland up in the back here is where the community organisation, the Langham Initiative, had aspiration for native woodland creation. And the boundary for the community-owned land is right along that conifer plantation there, and that's a Forest and Land Scotland plantation behind us. And that also represents the danger that the people of Langham were wanting to address, was the huge increase in commercial forestry in the south of Scotland, and the fact that this site held such an environmental and cultural importance to the community that they didn't want to see commercial plantation expand onto it any further. So we had an aspiration of about 500 acres of native woodland creation on here, and our conversations with the Woodland Trust led them to thinking, well, we can probably help with the 200,000 towards the purchase, but we have to have some sort of agreement that that will be used to get carbon credits in the future. So that leaves us with quite a few different things to consider, and that's where I'm going to go on to just now. Is the sort of stuff that, if this is the way you're going to go, some of the things you might consider at the start. And I guess the first one is that for any communities looking to do something similar, whether that's to fund purchase, whether that's to do woodland creation on already owned land, is think of what your objectives for the land are and why you're wanting to do what you're going to do. For us at Langham, it was about, it was about climate change. It was about trying to do our part for the climate emergency, but it's also about nature-based tourism. It's about amenity access. It's about wildlife conservation. So we want to be able to control elements of the woodland design that meet all of these objectives. And that comes down to the word control quite strongly there. And we're so thrilled to be working with the Woodland Trust with an organisation such as them. And we see that as being a real positive, having a really prominent ENGO backing a relatively new community landowner to the extent that they have. But there is also this question of what control you might lose by entering woodland into the woodland the Woodland Carbon Code. And it was a conversation we had quite a lot with the Woodland Trust going into this, where there's a number of options you can do here. If we're talking about the Woodland Trust being our intermediary, being that woodland developer, then they've put quite a bit of capital already into this. So you can understand the sort of desire they would have for some control as well. But we had a sort of ethical issue of, well, we're just purchasing land for the community. To immediately give up full control was something we weren't entirely comfortable with. So we were left with a couple of options on how we were going to take this forward. One of them was to lease the land to the Woodland Trust and allow them to take the process through. But then how are we sure that all of our objectives are going to be met? So where we ended up going, and the agreement that we have at the moment, is that it was felt in this circumstance that a conservation burden was suitable for specifically that 500 acres of land. So this area over here, there's a conservation burden now on that. We also agreed a standard security with the Woodland Trust on just that part of land. And what we also now have is the ability further down the line to enter into a lease. If we do, once we get into the planning, once we get to a bit further down the line, if we decide, well, actually our capacity isn't there to take this forward, we can go back and we can say to the Woodland Trust, actually, a lease might be the way to go here. So I think that there's some important things to consider. And I think one of the other elements to consider that's important is on this pricing of carbon. So what is your product? And it's a good way to start thinking of carbon in that way a little bit for yourselves, is that a number of people who want to buy it are thinking of it as a product. So you have to start thinking about it that way. So that means it can be packaged and it can be marketed in a certain way. We got some scales of what the price of carbon might be at the start of the presentations today. But marketing and your product right and packaging it right, there are certain private individuals who are also wanting to pay for carbon, but they want to see additional benefits. And there have been cases where higher prices have been paid, not specifically for the carbon themselves, but because of the project that the carbon is connected to. So you have to consider that as well. I think as well, understanding the mechanism of what profit you might get. So I think again it was covered in the first talk a little bit about how much you want to do in house and how much you would like to have a partner involved in that, and keep your options open for as long as possible on that. Investigate all the options, and then decide whether you have the capacity internally or not, and that may be a good driver for your decision on whether to bring in some sort of third-party intermediary there. But another consideration I think is important is, and in woodland creation, sequestering carbon, all vitally important and things that we have to be looking at now as responsible landowners, as communities who can make a difference. But you also have to consider what your future land use is. We've had the term 100 years said this morning. You are making decisions for future generations now. So do take consideration over, okay, you can have immediate profit now, or you can sell your WCUs later on, but you are making a decision over an area of land for future generations. This is a very longer term than planning is usually done for land uses. So certainly make a consideration into that. And then the sort of last one I'm going to end on here, I think, is that the carbon market, well, carbon trading isn't necessarily young, but the carbon market and its current boom is relatively young, and carbon prices are likely to increase. We can't say for certain, and perhaps some of the future models of calculating carbon may be more robust. We don't know yet, but it is worth considering if it's a necessity for you to do it now, or whether it is worth waiting. These are just considerations to have, and I just think they're important ones to have because of the magnitude of the decision you might be making with the finite resource, which is land, that you have. But certainly at Langham, this was a real key part of our overall aims and objectives for community ownership here. And also there are restrictions on where you can get funding for land purchase. So I think that it all played well together for where we were trying to get to. And I think that's really all I have at the moment for us, because we are very much at the very start of this. We're going to be working very closely with the Woodland Trust over the coming years to deliver this woodland. And it's a real benefit. So I just think make sure you take your time, make sure that it is the right thing for your community, for your land use, and yeah, try and make the best decision you can with the information you have. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Lots of food for thought in that presentation. And yes, I think there's quite a lot of concern about the impact of these new markets on land prices and what role that will have or impact it'll have on future acquisitions. I don't know if Callum's planning to discuss that later on. If not, then maybe it's something for the Q&A. Meanwhile, we've been focusing so far about the Woodland Carbon Code. I'm going to widen it a little bit. Magnus Davidson, an ex-speaker, is going to talk just a little bit about potential opportunities in the future from the sale of other ecosystem services. So I'll hand over to Magnus now.
Perfect. Cheers, John. I'm just going to give some forewarning. I've been getting kicked off the connection here with my first day back in the office every 10 minutes or so, and I'm probably due to be kicked off again pretty soon. But if you bear with me, I will get let back in like 20 seconds or so, and I'll use that time against my 10 minutes. So I'm actually a director with Community Land Scotland, but my day job is with the Environmental Research Institute. We're part of North Highland College, UHI. I'm based here in Thurso, Scotland's most northerly mainland town next to the Flow Country. Bear with me. Quickly today, as John alluded to, I'm going to run through some ecosystem services. I'm going to take a little bit of time to define ecosystem services, talk about payments for ecosystem services, and touch briefly on the peatland code, because I think it will be of interest to the communities. But then I'm really going to spend most of my time looking at how communities can get involved, potentially examples and suggestions for the future. This is, I think Andy alluded to earlier, whether with a short period of time you go into it in detail or try and rush through it all. I'm going to not go into it in detail. So if you're interested in any of this in detail, please get in touch and I can try and answer questions or put you in touch with people that can. So what are ecosystem services? Effectively, they're the benefits that people derive from ecosystems. That's from IUCN, and a more longer way from Nature Scott. Ecosystem services are the direct and indirect contributions ecosystems, known as natural capital, provide for human well-being and quality of life. On the right-hand side, we've got this beautiful wheel of ecosystem services from Nature Scott as well, looking at provisioning, cultural, regulatory, and supporting services. Some of those will probably be quite familiar. So you have provisional tangible goods like food and wood. We have regulatory services like climate flood management, and we've got cultural services like recreation education, as well as supporting services in which ecosystems wouldn't be able to function. Hi folks, sorry that was me getting kicked out. It should be okay now for the rest of the session. Hopefully. So yeah, just while this loads, some of these are very familiar in terms of ecosystem services. Some of these will certainly be ecosystem services for the future. What I'm really interested in here for community land perspective is, for example, cultural perspectives, looking at whether or not ecosystem services can be used to pay for things like, for example, repeopling, but also as we look to things like the rewilding agenda, can we do that with the benefit of ecosystem services? Again, bear with me while this loads. Not very professional at all today. Moving on to payments for ecosystem services. This is effectively payments for ecosystem services, as it says on the tin, but it's a name given to a variety of arrangements where beneficiaries of environmental services, maybe the polluter, reward those whose lands provide the services with subsidies or market payments. So you could, for example, have a business that pollutes carbon dioxide, paying a community landowner to sequester that carbon. Again, really important in this instance that we're not just doing this to greenwash. It needs to be those, as we look to a net zero future, those parts of the business which are just, we can't change. Some various payments for ecosystem services, the Woodland Code we've heard about today, peatland code I'll touch on very briefly, and others around other ecosystem services, drinking water, for example. So the peatland code is a voluntary standard for UK peatland projects wishing to market that climate benefit of peatland restoration, largely the carbon stored and sequestered in the peatland. A very important issue for me here. I spend a huge amount of time in the flow country, of course, a large area of blanket bog. Issued by the IUCN, UK National Committee, and this is where it really gets important, is to provide assurance to those buyers that their greenhouse gas assertion shall be validated and verified by an independent body to a reasonable level of assurance. That's given the buyer confidence that the carbon is being stored, is being sequestered. The legal ownership or tenure of the land for the duration of the project shall be demonstrated for the project area. I've included that so we can allude to common grazings. How do we increase, for me, how do we increase awareness and community uptake of PES like the peatland code? I looked at the public register and couldn't see any community landowners. I'm not aware of any community landowners. I would be really interested if others are. But what can we learn from the application of the peatland code for future potential payments for ecosystem services in terms of complexity and how these, how we might run through these? So these are some suggestions for increased community involvement that I've put together, and the first of which is working as an academic with communities, is translating this academic and policy terminology into context that are tangible benefits to communities. Ecosystem services, payment for ecosystem services, their academic and policy terms, they're not the best for working with communities. Can we take lessons from community energy, largely onshore wind and hydropower, in the complexity and the scale of work required by communities, but also in the potential benefit and returns? We know community energy provides a huge amount of returns compared to more traditional developer-led. Can we use the social and cultural remit of community-owned land and stewardship to be used to market ecosystem system services as a USP. I think Kevin almost alluded to that earlier. Can we market carbon sequestered from community owned land at a higher value, for example? Can communities benefit without land asset? I would like to see a lot more land in community ownership, but for example, if not, can we see community benefit funds as one example? Again, leaning on the renewable industry, for example. Community landowners can find synergies and economies of scale by working together. That's just a suggestion. Community landowners may be managing smaller scales of land. Can we pile together and market community owned land or payments for ecosystem services together to get that economy of scale that buyers are interested in? Very much the second last slide here, we've got 550,000 hectares of common grazing, some owned from community landowners, some potentially future community landowners, Scottish Government land. Can they benefit from the Woodland Code and the Peatland Code? Callum will allude to it, but we're already seeing good, if not best practice from community landowners from an environmental and a climate sense. Can we monetize this? Can we use payment for ecosystem services to increase community owned land, potentially via access to capital, potentially borrowing against future income? Again, Kevin perhaps alluded to it there. Can community owners take over land assets from traditional NGOs with the benefit of PES to manage land more sustainably from a social and an economic remit? Some NGOs own land because it was a necessity to get land into ownership to protect from development. As we look to the future, can we transfer the asset to the community itself? Can we integrate payments for ecosystem services into community-owned repeopling and rewilding agendas, again, around both cultural heritage and environment, as well as community-owned land and potential community-owned land having a lot of strengths and opportunities, but as Callum will hopefully allude to, and as Kevin has alluded to, there are challenges and risks largely here in terms of the work required, as well as the driving price of land going up because of potential carbon. That is me. Thank you very much for bearing with my terrible internet connection. Hopefully it wasn't too disruptive.
Magnus, thank you very much. And no, that was grand. Lots to consider for the future. We'll move on very quickly to our final, last but absolutely not least speaker, Dr. Callum MacLeod, who's going to talk about further policy and funding support for communities to help them engage to the fullest possible extent in woodland carbon and other ecosystem services. So hand over to you, Callum.
Thanks very much indeed, John, that's excellent. One of the challenges of going last in a set of discussions like this, you're always tempted just to say yes, what they said, because a lot of the previous speakers have covered a good deal, very eloquently, of the kind of areas that I would look to cover as well. But what I want to do is really just provide a whistle-stop tour, if you like, around some of the key, as John said, policy issues around the way in which community landowners engage with the climate emergency, and specifically around the issue of carbon and woodland and peatland, as other speakers have mentioned, are of course absolutely integral to that, and these codes are integral to that as well. And I want to begin basically where everyone's been putting up some really nice photographs of various places, not least Egg and other places as well, and Langham, of course. This is a photograph of the woodland on the Orbist estate on the Isle of Skye. When I'm not doing my part of my day job, which is being policy director of Community Land Scotland, I work with communities who are looking to buy land and other assets, and this is a project that I'm involved in at the moment on the Isle of Skye. And Orbist estate is currently owned by Highlands and Islands Enterprise. It's not privately owned. It's not owned by an environmental NGO or other owners. So there's some real kind of opportunities there as well. But as Magnus mentioned, there are some real threats and challenges actually as well in terms of how community landowners engage with this process and this rapidly evolving market in terms of carbon and where land sits within that. And really land reform, by which I mean changes to land ownership and land use in the public interest, is an absolutely central dimension of all of this agenda, really. So I want to just briefly touch upon the kind of engagement that Community Land Scotland's had in that regard thus far, and see where that links to the issues we've just discussed. As I also said, this is a relatively new area for Community Land Scotland in terms of engagement, but it's very clear that community landowners have to connect very much with this agenda. We published a report in March of this year titled Community Landowners in the Climate Emergency, looked at a whole host of different issues there and had 6 case studies of urban and rural community landowners that were involved in a lot of exciting projects in terms of addressing the climate emergency itself, ranging from peatland restoration in Lewis through to transport initiatives and other elements as well in Huntly and stuff in Edinburgh as well in Bridge and Farmhouse. The kind of key messages coming out of that, generally speaking, and specifically with regard to the case studies, is that community landowners are well placed to play a leading role in this agenda if the conditions are right. They can do that in terms, as I said, with regard to woodland and peatland codes. There's a trust element that's really important at the local level, which means that they're an important partner. They have strong local networks, and critically as well, community landowners have an important role to play in terms of delivering a just transition to net zero. And that's really important. This whole notion of a just transition to the net zero carbon economy by 2045 is absolutely integral to how we think about these issues about community, land, carbon, and how we balance public benefits through carbon sequestration and the whole kind of agenda there, and community benefits as well. And it's very clear from the Just Transition Commission's final report, which was published in March as well, that part of this process of ensuring a just transition must be about making sure that the benefits in investment, carbon sequestration, are felt as widely as possible. That careful design and meaningful engagement, there's a risk that benefits may flow mainly to large landowners and opportunities for community benefit will be missed. And that, to my mind, and to Community Land Scotland's mind, really makes that connection between land ownership and land use in this rapidly evolving market very, very important to be placed front and centre to make sure these community and public benefits are achieved in practice. One of the recommendations that the Land Commission identified as well in relation to developing its recommendations was around having a public interest test in place within the set of recommendations that it has there. So a public interest test with regard to changes in land ownership above a certain threshold. So that's a critically important element from our perspective. This is a photograph again from that report that I just mentioned from Community Land Scotland, from a Brecon Forest Trust and the Forest School. That's a very central part of what's going on within the community-owned woodlands there, and the children there that are enthralled in aspects of the educational process and a stream there in relation to that. So I think that's a really nice example of the kind of broader social benefits in terms of how that works as well, and the significance of that. However, there are some significant issues here, as Kevin's mentioned, that others have as well, with regard to the land market itself and how that's playing out in practice in relation to carbon. And we can see that from some of the analysis coming through from various sources, but this is from Evelyn Channing, who's Head of Rural Agency for Scotland at Savills, talking very much here about the environmental, social and corporate governance agenda, which is, you can see the quote there, but it's basically bringing buyers forward in all shapes and sizes, from small businesses to large charities to investment companies. There is a huge push, let us be in no doubt about this, in terms of, as it says there, a push for land ownership and land purchase that's going to ensure that forest and planting land market is absolutely booming. So the question again becomes, and to relate it back to the Just Transition Commission, how do we actually ensure that there's a connection made between carbon sequestration, woodland planting and peatland restoration as well, and the community benefits that are aligned with public benefits also in relation to that. Well, in that context, the manifesto that Community Land Scotland published, we actually published it back in November of last year, in advance of the recently completed Scottish parliamentary election, makes a number of proposals that are themed around a number of interlinked themes, one of which is controlling land monopolies to protect the public interest. So there's something there around. If we're having a kind of new green land grab where you're getting carbon corporates, green layers with varying degrees of kind of community connection and integration in terms of what they're doing, and also other large investments in terms of that, how do we actually ensure that the public interest features very significantly with regard to that? We also need to think about how we empower communities to build that local resilience. We've seen how that's happened in Egg. We need to make sure that happens in other communities as well, so that we can get community and wider public benefit from the sort of ecosystem services that Magnus identified. And clearly that whole notion of a just transition is very central to all of this. So there are a number of kind of factors which need to be borne in mind and we need to address in taking that forward. One of which will be captured in Scotland within hopefully a new land reform bill, which the SNP government and the Greens, and indeed there's a further cross-party consensus for, are very much in favour of. So what will that mean in terms of the public policy goal of diversifying land ownership in Scotland and rural land ownership, which is highly concentrated at the moment, as I'm sure we all know. So where are the kind of opportunities there? So that's an overarching structural problem or issue. But we also need to think as well about capacity for communities, awareness raising, and that kind of peer-to-peer support, and also partnership working with a number of other players, some of whom will be the large-scale investors and other types of investors and other types of organisations that are very keen to sort of tell that story of charismatic carbon and what that might mean in terms of their offsetting agenda as well, and how we actually connect that to the community land ownership, land reform agenda of actually creating sustainable, long-lasting and thriving communities, which actually connect up these different factors to ensure that the climate emergency is addressed and these communities themselves play their full part in doing that. So I'll draw to a close there because I'm sure we want to spend some time having some questions as well. So thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you, Callum, and thank you again to all of our speakers. Really fascinating and got through a huge agenda in a very brief period of time. So thanks, I'm sure, from everybody. I'm going to hand over to Ailsa, who's going to chair our Q&A. So all yours, Ailsa.
Ian, thanks, John. Thanks again to all the speakers. I've taken in a huge amount there. I've got some sort of fairly quick practical questions, which I think people will find useful, and then some sort of bigger strategic questions. So I'm going to ping off with the practical questions first, and I think the first one probably for John. What type of woodland creation is eligible? Is it all types, and is it likely to be sort of the native woodland, broadland plantations that create the most value as opposed to conifer, or does it not really matter?
All types of woodland creation are eligible. There's a difference that fast-growing commercial conifers will sequester carbon quicker. However, most of them are also being grown to be cut down after 40 or 50 years. So that rather puts a cap on how, what the total number of credits you might get from that sort of plantation is going to be. Whereas the assumption with a lot of the native woodlands being planted is that although they will grow slower and the carbon units relating to sequestration will come in slower, actually they're not planned to be felled, and therefore in over 100 years there will be quite a significant volume of units. So there are different kind of profiles, and the Woodland Carbon Code has a really effective calculator that allows you to kind of go in and play with the numbers and see how that's going to work. And Andy might talk about that in more detail, but broadly everything's eligible, but there will be different volumes and different timescales that they operate over.
Brilliant, thanks, John. That's useful. Andy, anything to add to that?
No, I think John did marvellously.
Well done, John. A question for you then, Andy, that's come in. A minimum size. I think for your presentation you said there isn't really a minimum size, but presumably there's a minimum size of woodland that is financially viable to go through the registration and validation processes if you don't group it as you've suggested.
Yeah, so if you were to go it alone, this is just for me, personal preference, I wouldn't register a scheme on its own if it was below 3 hectares, but I would definitely register schemes below 3 hectares if you're looking at grouping them together. What can be difficult is trying to group them as effectively as you can. So grouping 2 schemes together, you see a bit of a cost saving, but if you can get that 15 projects plus 50 hectares of small projects together, and you'll be laughing, the amount of cost of verification and validation will be negligible in comparison to the amount of money you can make from all of the other potential funding sources that you might have, carbon being just one of them.
Brilliant, thanks, Andy. And the question about additionality, you know, I was going to ask this on the basis of our previous conversation. If you've got an obligation to replant your woodland under some sort of forest management plan, does that constitute additionality if you've got an obligation to do it anyway?
Depends on what the obligation is, but essentially, if you're legally bound to plant a woodland in that place, then no, you won't be able to generate carbon units. You will fail additionality. The 2 examples I usually give are, first of all, restocking. So as John said, if you were to clear fell a site and legally, as we all know, are obliged to restock that site with woodland, that's not eligible for woodland carbon units. And secondly, compensatory planting. So if I was to build a road and cut down a hectare of woodland and then have to plant a hectare elsewhere, then wouldn't be classed. Comes in when you're looking at things like biodiversity credits and net gain. So if I had built a road, and the biodiversity net gain field is quite complicated, but let's say I destroyed 10 biodiversity units worth of biodiversity and biodiversity net gain, I had to buy back 11 biodiversity net gain units worth elsewhere. There's no obligation for that to be woodland. There's an obligation to generate some more biodiversity units, but they don't have to be woodland. So that would technically be able to pass additionality. But for those trickier ones, it'd be worth getting in touch with a project developer and chatting them, then they'll chat you through that.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Andy. A question for Kevin now. Can you explain a bit more about conservation burdens? And you mentioned it on the Langham project, and it was the right thing for Langham to do. So a bit more about what obligations that places on you as their landowner.
Yeah, hi, Ilse. Yeah, so I mean, essentially, a conservation burden is something that restricts what you can do with an area of land. It's something that's quite unique to Scots law in terms of the UK at the moment, although variations on conservation burdens are quite prevalent in other countries. You know, you might have easements in Canada or something like that. So there are different terms. You know, I think that where it was the right thing for Langham was that we needed to give the Woodland Trust some comfort in their investment. So that was one of the reasons it was sort of a useful tool there. I think one of the things that you have to be aware of with conservation burdens going forward is that if you were to speak to solicitors and get legal advice, what they would kind of tell you is that they're quite weak legally in court in Scotland, and they can be appealed at land court. So there's some thought about this model needing to be updated with conservation burdens within the UK and particularly Scotland as well. But yeah, I mean, essentially what we've agreed to is that for 100 years the use of, you know, that land will have native woodland on it, you know, for that duration of when the carbon's going to have to be sequestered. So I think that yeah, it was a useful thing to use here. We have other assets within the land holding we've purchased that meant that we're not doing something that's of a detriment to other community needs or other community desires. So I think that it fitted well with what we were wanting to do.
Brilliant, thanks, Kevin. Right, a question from Sandra. Many of the community landowners are landowners of land under crofting tenure. How does this work with respect to maximising community benefit from carbon potential? I know Magnus has had to leave because of his internet connection issues. I have had a couple of conversations with crofting landlords who have confirmed that obviously it's got to be a conversation between the landowner and the crofters, particularly in terms of how you deal with sharing income and any conservation burdens or other commitments that come along with the carbon code. So I think it is a possibility, but obviously you've got a much larger cohort of people there to agreement in terms of how the income is going to be split. But speaking to one or two people that are interested in, they don't see a crofting community per se or crofting land as not being eligible, but it is just how the arrangement itself can work. So I don't know, is anyone else on the call, Callum or John, have you got any thoughts on that? And none of us are crofting specialists.
Just since the changes in one of the Crofter Acts a long time ago, 2.5 decades ago or so, the kind of right to plant the trees and to collect the grants for planting the trees has gone with the common grazings committees. And so I think the right to sort of sell the carbon credits would go to them as well, rather than the landowner, whether that's a community landowner or a private landowner. But in those cases, the private landowner or the crofting landowner has to give their permission, and that would be an opportunity for a negotiation about you know, how the benefits were being shared. I mean, I think, as in all these things, the net income is small compared to actually the thing that makes the scheme viable in the first place. So there's certainly at the moment with woodland carbon on common grazings, is unlikely to be a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. It's about making schemes viable and achievable more than a massive income generator, I think. And the woodlands themselves then have other benefits for those communities.
Can I just come in on that as well? Not specifically on the woodland dimension, but certainly in the peatland element. Certainly one of the case studies that we feature in Community Landowners and the Climate Emergency, the report that we published along with the Community Woodlands Association, Community Energy Scotland, and the Woodland Croft Partnership, is a really good example there in terms of what's happening on the Carloway estate in Lewis and some of the partnership working that's going on. That's a multi-partnership approach whereby it's croftland, so the crofters are very much involved. Nature Scot are heavily involved as well, as are the Carloway Estate Trust as the landowner there. So I think, yeah, as a non-crofting specialist, law specialist, far from it, I wouldn't want to delve too deeply into the kind of the complications of some of the legislative dimensions, but I think there is good practice, and that's one good example of it, where you do get that kind of connection between crofting interests and the broader community interests within that context. So I think there's scope to build on that.
Brilliant, thanks Callum and John for that. That's really useful. A quick question for Andy, which might be a 1 or 2 word answer. Should communities look to insure their woodlands once they've entered into a carbon code contract, or is it covered under the carbon code?
It's not covered under the carbon code, no. As was mentioned earlier, the carbon code is conservative in the buffer. We have a 20% buffer. We're also conservative in the assignment of carbon units to a project, but that's obviously not your only liability. You've got fire, pests, diseases, wind, some of which are insurable and some aren't. My recommendation would be to insure if you don't have the capital or are unlikely to have the capital if there was a catastrophe to be able to replant at your own expense. But yeah, woodland insurance is definitely something that you could look at, and many people that are within the woodland carbon code will have insurance, particularly, as I say, for wind and fire.
Brilliant, thanks Andy. A question from Jakob now in the south of Scotland, which relates to I think the sort of ecosystem services around agricultural land, and unfortunately Magnus has lost his connection, but I could have asked him to answer this. The Environment Agency down in England recently produced a really useful chart about the performance of different offsetting approaches, and two of those are around excuse me, soils on arable land and soils on pasture land. So what I'll do when we send the links out afterwards of the recording to all the participants, we'll also send a link to that Environment Agency table, which shows all of the different types of ecosystem services that might be coming online, and it's really useful because it also talks about the confidence in the science of those and the longevity of those. So it's a really useful document. So that will answer your question, Jacob, that it is in consideration around arable and pasture land. John.
I was just going to add that with those sort of things where someone's being paid to stop doing something as opposed to doing something fresh, there's always difficulties in proving the additionality, that they weren't just going to stop anyway for a business decision because it wasn't viable anymore. And I think that will always be challenging in those sort of cases, pulling out what's a genuine decision to change purely because of the finance, or just paying someone for something they were going to do anyway, which is not an approach we really want to be endorsing.
The only thing that we do include, John, in terms of that change of land use, we wouldn't consider the methane emitted from cattle beef, even though rightly so, you know, you are potentially reducing your emissions enormously. We wouldn't assign credits to that. But the one type of change in land use that we will assign more credits for would be arable farming on mineral soil. If that was being converted to woodland, you can claim a proportion of carbon that's not being emitted essentially from that heavy intensive use of the agricultural land. So for beef or dairy, no, but if it was arable, then yes, you can claim some extra carbon. It's not a massive amount, but it's a small amount of carbon units you can claim on top of that, which represents that reduction in emissions that you're having already from the soil.
Thanks, Andy. One final question before a general question, a really good one, I think. Is there a danger these carbon units become the next financial bubble at the hands of speculators and scammers? Sorry, Andy, of course I'm going to come to you first, and then I'll come to John. Sure,
no, that's fine. Is missold PIUs going to be the new missold PPI sort of thing? There's absolutely a risk of that happening. It already is happening with other international carbon standards, where people have invested in woodland creation in Ethiopia, and then they go there 5 years later and realize no trees have even been planted. Now, this is where the Woodland Carbon Code is a UK government-backed standard, and the rigor and the tests and the ongoing verifications and stuff really mitigate the likelihood of that happening. Not only that, but we also ensure that any of our carbon traders, so people that are buying carbon to sell on, are Financial Conduct Authority regulated, and that again goes a long way. It's quite hard to get to that stage, and so that goes a long way in ensuring that our scheme, our only government-backed scheme aside from the Peatland Carbon Code, is robust enough to prevent this happening. But in terms of the greenwashing and that side of things, that's always going to happen to a degree, not always from a purposeful, oh, we're claiming carbon neutral even though we know we're not. Some people just don't understand the premise, so there's always going to be some confusion, but generally we're far more robust than almost any other scheme. Obviously I'm going to say that, but I do believe it.
No, that sounds reassuring. Thank you, Andy. So one final quick question, because we've only got a couple of minutes, so I'll just run around everybody. If you can just give me a couple of sentences, and I'm going to come to Kevin first, because you've obviously using the carbon code really supported the Langham purchase. So presumably, and I'm presuming that you would advise other communities to look at it, but what's the one sort of lesson that you would give to other communities when they're thinking about this approach?
For me, the key, the absolute fundamental is think about the long term with it. That's for me, is think about what you want long term. Think about your long term objectives, what's best for your community and best for the wider public benefit. And that would be it. Regardless of when you're making any of the decisions throughout, how much woodland to plant, what carbon units to sell, what to put in, what amenity use you want to make sure you still have in your plan, all of that, think long term, because that's how long your woodland, carbon woodlands is a long term commitment. So keep that in mind. That would be my biggest take.
No, very useful, thank you. Becca, you've approached it from the other end where you already own the land and you're planting. And what would be your one lesson for other communities that are looking to plant new areas of woodland?
I think for us, it was a very new market for the IEHT. It's certainly not something that we've done before. So research and learn from others' experiences. I think that the actual sort of analysing what the proposal, what your proposal is, why you're exploring the route you're going down, but certainly reaching out to others and learning from others' experiences, worth its weight in gold, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I would echo that, Becca. Callum, what do you think the big opportunities for communities are going to be in the carbon code arena, whether that's woodland, peatland, or these other ecosystem services?
I think the opportunities are really going to be around what they want, as Becca and Kevin have said, what they want to achieve through embarking on these processes. So it's like, what ends is this potentially a means to? And I think the critical bigger picture question there is to ensure that their engagement with the code itself and the peatland code is done in such a way as to enable them to benefit to the maximum, to deliver those community and wider public benefits. So I think there's a big agenda ahead in terms of the policy dimensions of all this, to make sure that we get that just transition and connect up all of these disparate elements in a cohesive way.
No, thanks, Callum. That's certainly an area that Community Land Scotland are going to be focusing on for the next 12 months or so. So I'll come to Andy. What one lesson would you want communities to take away from today?
Can I kind of cheat and say what everyone has just said? I think kind of covers everything, really. But yeah, do your research, make sure that you consider the long-term obligations and objectives, and do your research again, because there's so much to look into, and speak to as many project developers and people that you may be willing to work with, and consider all options. There might be a lot of different routes to go down. It's not just carbon, it's not just water, it's a lot of different things.
Yeah. Right, great advice, Andy. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to John to finish up, to give his reflections on the session today, and thank him again for his support in helping organising this webinar. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Elsa. Yeah, I'd like to finish, saying obviously Community Woodlands Association, inevitably we're enthusiasts for woodland, and we see carbon finance as a great opportunity, as a means to delivering more woodland, more land in community hands, and delivering wider community aspirations. It's not an end in itself, it's a means to deliver all the things that you as communities want to deliver. I'd like to thank all of our speakers who've been really fantastic, covered a wide range of topics, great deal of information, and also very useful answers to the Q&A. We will be placing reports and recordings of this event online, but there are also lots of people that you can come to for help or to ask questions. Myself, Community Land Scotland, and the speakers today. If you have any follow-up questions that you haven't had answered, then please get in touch. There's a lot of advice and support available out there to help community members, community group members navigate what's quite a complex task. I'll leave it at that. So thank you very much. Thank you, Elsa, and thank you in particular, Kerry, for managing everything behind the scenes. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. I hope it's sunny where you are. It certainly is here. Right.
Thanks, John. Bye, everyone.